Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Political Lens podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the strike on Venezuela as well as its impact on civilians and explain the global fallout and moving forward in the events of the last few days. History will not judge this moment by the speed of the operation or the rhetoric that followed it. It will judge it by what replaces the shock for Venezuela. This is the difference between liberation and collapse. A nation that has already endured economic devastation, mass migration, and institutional decay now stands at a crossroads where legitimacy matters more than force. If order gives way to fragmentation, if revenge replaces reconciliation, or if control is perceived as an exploitation rather than stabilization, then the suffering of the Venezuelan people will not end. It will simply change form. The promise of this moment lies not in removal of a man, but in whether Venezuelans are finally given the space and security and the agency to rebuild their own institutions without fear of coercion. For the United States, the consequences are equally defining. America has demonstrated that it will possess unmatched military reach and the will to act decisively. But power is only half of leadership. The other half is restraint, legitimacy, and responsibility for outcomes. From this point forward, the United States will be judged not by whether it could intervene, but whether it can transition from force to diplomacy, from control to cooperation, from unilateral action to multilateral legitimacy. If the United States fails to articulate clear limits, timelines, and accountability, it risks reinforcing the global perception that makes right. If it succeeds, it may demonstrate the power when used can still be guided by law and principle rather than permanence. Geopolitically, this moment accelerates a shift already underway. The world is moving away from an era. It won't cost us anything because the money coming out of the ground is very substantial, so it's not going to cost us anything. We will. One second. We want to be surrounded by countries that aren't housing all of our enemies all over the world. That's what was happening, and you don't want to have that. But we're going to be rebuilding, and we're not spending money. The oil companies are going to go in, they're going to spend money. Geopolitically, this moment accelerates a shift already underway. The world is moving away from an era where norms alone restrain states and into one where actions redefine those norms in real time. The allies are necessarily reassessing assumptions about American leadership. Adversaries are recalculating thresholds, doctrines, and red lines. Some will see this as a deterrence restored. Others will see it as precedent set. In either case, the margin of error has narrowed. Future crises from Eastern Europe to South China Sea will now unfold in a world where regime capture is no longer theoretical but imaginable. That alone changes strategic behavior. What happens next will echo from beyond Caracas in Washington. If the moment leads to stabilization, lawful transition, and regional cooperation, it may be remembered as a hard but necessary intervention in a world where state-sponsored criminality had gone unchecked. If it leads to prolonged instability, contested legitimacy, or expanded confrontation, it may be remembered as another fracture point in an already fragile international system. This is why coming days matter more than the operation itself. This is why transparency, diplomacy, and restraint are no longer operational. They are strategic necessities. The true test of power is not the ability to act, but the wisdom to know how, when to stop. What replaces this moment will determine whether history records it as the beginning of a recovery or an opening chapter of a deeper global disorder. Politically, this moment cuts straight through the core tensions inside the president's own coalition. His base is not monolithic. It is a coalition built on overlapping but sometimes competing priorities. Strength abroad, restraint in foreign entanglements, and economic nationalism, as well as border security and deep skepticism of endless wars. This action satisfies some of these instincts, while directly challenging others. For supporters who prioritize strength and deterrence, the operation reinforces a long held belief that American power had been restrained, diluted, or apologetically wielded in recent years. To them, long standing failure to enforce consequences, they see it as decisive, finite, and purposeful, very different from the open ended nation building projects of Iraq and Afghanistan. In this framing, the president did not entangle the United States in another conflict. He ended a threat swiftly and on American terms. But those within the president's base who voted specifically to end foreign distractions and focus inward, this moment is far more complicated. These voters are not isolationists in the traditional sense. They support a strong military, but they are deeply hostile to anything that resembles mission creep. Their concern is not the strike itself, but what comes after. They ask, how long are we involved? Who governs? Who pays? And at the point, does temporary stabilization become permanent responsibility? For them, the fear is not weakness, it is a repetition. They remember how actions in the past slowly evolved into generational commitments. Alrighty. Now this is where the president's no new wars promise becomes politically decisive. Whether this action is perceived as a violation of that promise depends also on entirely on what follows. If the United States forces remain limited, objectives remain narrow, and timelines are clearly defined, the president can credibly argue that this was not a war, but an enforced action. However, Americans' personnel resources or political capital become embedded in Venezuelan internal governance, opposition within his own coalition will grow quickly. His base will tolerate force, it will not tolerate adrift. The oil question sits at the center of the political calculus and it cannot be dismissed. When the supporters believe, rightly or wrongly, that American economic leverage has become surrendered over the past decade through sanctions, mismanagement, energy restrictions, and foreign policy decisions that has raised domestic costs. When they look at Venezuela, they do not see a failed state. They see the world's largest proven oil reserves sitting outside U.S. influence, while Americans paid higher prices at home. In the context, suspicions that oil played a role in the decision are not fringe, they are mainstream. However, politically, the president does not need to argue that this was about oil. In a transactional sense, what resonates with his base is a broader narrative that previous leadership allowed strategic assets to fall into hostile or corrupt hands. And the state resorting leverage is part of restoring national sovereignty. Framed this way, oil is not a motive, it is a symbol of mismanagement and lost advantage. The distinction matters politically, even if critics reject it. As for the idea that the president is trying to get back what was taken from the American people, that argument will land strongly with voters who already believe the United States has borne disproportionate costs, financial, strategic, and moral, while others exploited the system. To them, the reclaiming leverage over energy markets is not imperialism, it is self-defense against economic vulnerability. But this argument has a shelf life. If Americans do not see tangible benefits, lower energy costs, and reduced instability, or a clear disengagement, support will erode even among his voters. Critical opposition to those actions will not only come from outside the president's base, it will come from within it, framed not as a moral outrage, but as a caution. Alrighty. Lost my spot here. Critical opposition to the action will not come outside the president's base. It will come from within. Framed not as moral outrage but as caution, the critics will argue that strength at home requires discipline abroad, and every foreign commitment drains focus from broader security infrastructure, inflation, and domestic cohesion. Their pressure will identify if Congress is sidelined or if objectives remain vague. Ultimately, this moment will be decided not by ideology but by outcomes and clarity. If the president has convincingly demonstrated that this action was limited, strategic, temporary, and materially beneficial to the United States' security and economic stability, much of his base will stay with him. Even if uneasily, if the situation drifts, expands, or becomes morally ambiguous, fractures will deepen. This is not just a foreign policy test, it is a test in narrative, discipline, boundary setting, and a follow through. The president's supporters are not asking for perfection, they are asking for proof that this does not become the very thing they voted against. As it unfolds, the political battle will shift from the whether the action was justified to whether it remains contained. In the first phase, most presidents enjoy a rally effect, even among skeptical supporters, because decisive action projects control, but that window is short, within weeks, not months. The president's base will begin measuring rhetoric against reality. They will look for indicators that the operation is not mutating into a long-term obligation. Troop levels, financial commitments, and diplomatic languages and media framing. Any ambiguity will be interrupted and as slippage. This is where internal messaging becomes as important as foreign diplomacy. The president's strongest political instinct, one that carried him into office, is skepticism toward the permanent solutions imposed from Washington. To maintain credibility, he will need to consistently reinforce Venezuela's future, not America's responsibility to design, only its responsibility to not destabilize further. The moment the U.S. is perceived as choosing leaders, writing economic policy, or guaranteeing outcomes, the focus on factions will begin to peel away. At the same time, there is a political risk on the opposite flank. Appearing to retreat too quickly, some supporters will argue that empowering criminal networks or hostile foreign actors to fill the gap, the president will have to walk a narrow line, strong enough to deter backsliding, restrained enough to avoid ownership. That balance is difficult, and historically the administration needs to manage it cleanly. Congress will become a flashpoint even among allies of the president. There will be calls for briefings, resolutions, and oversight, not necessarily to block him, but to share accountability. How the president responds matters. Engaging Congress strategically, strengthening legitimacy, and diffusing blame, circumventing it reinforces accusations or executive outreach, and feeds distrust among constitutional conservatives in the base. The irony is that transparency, often viewed as constraint, may be his strongest political shield. Alrighty. Next, we're going to be talking about more globally, so I'll get to that in just 1 sec. Globally, the longer-term geopolitical consequences will start feeding back into domestic politics. If China or Russia responds asymmetrically through cyber activity, economic pressure, or proxy, escalation elsewhere, critics will argue the U.S. traded one problem for several others. Supporters will counter that deterrence requires risk. The president's political durability will hinge on whether Americans feel safer, more prosperous, and less distracted, not more exposed. The oil question will re-emerge here with sharper edges if energy markets stabilize and domestic prices ease. Supporters will quietly credit the administration regardless of official explanations. If prices rise or volatility increases, critics will argue the opposite, that intervention created instability rather than leverage. In politics, perception often overturns casualties. The president does not need to prove intent, he needs to demonstrate results.
And she's essentially willing to do what we think is necessary to make Venezuela great again. Very simple.
Another pressure point will be immigration. Any surge of Venezuelan migrants, whether due of instability or opportunity, will immediately reframe debate. Supporters who backed strong border enforcement will expect consistency if humanitarian. I'm sorry.
And yeah, I think I stick by my first statement. He's making cocaine.
Supporters who are backed strong border enforcement will expect consistency. If humanitarian expectations expand without clear limits, critics will argue that foreign intervention once again produced domestic consequences without consent. Managing this will require coordination across agencies and messaging that emphasizes control alongside compassion. Over time, the episode will also influence how the president's base interprets his broader worldview. If this action remains isolated, it will be remembered as an exception. If it becomes part of the pattern, it will redefine his presidency, and the base does not demand dismanagement from the world, but it demands selectivity. They want a country that chooses its battles carefully and finishes what it starts without inheriting other nations' dysfunctions. Alrighty. Ultimately, politically, this is less about Venezuelan, about trust. The president asked voters to believe that strength and restraint were not opposite, that America could be respected without being endlessly deployed. This moment tests that promise. The base will not abandon him quickly, but it will watch closely, and it will withdraw patience faster than enthusiasm if the story is not making sense. The path forward politically is clear, but unforgiving define the mission tightly, repeat the limits relentlessly, show measurable benefits at home, and excite before ownership sets in. Do that, and the president retains the loyalty of this coalition that values the results over ideology. Fail this action and risk becoming a very cautionary tale of his supporters believe they were voting to avoid. Here's a summary of how Venezuelan civilians are reacting on the ground at the U.S. strikes and reported capture of the President Nicolas Maduro based on the verified reports and real-time accounts. Alrighty. Let me find that. I just lost my spot. I'm sorry. Give me a second. Civilians in Venezuela are responding with a mixed fear of uncertainty, protests, in some cases cautious relief, rather than with uniform celebration and opposition. In areas of Caracas and other cities, there have been reports of explosions and heightened military presence, which have created an atmosphere of alarm as people try to understand what is happening and whether it is safe to leave their homes to go out to their daily lives. Psychological fear is commonly cited, with residents describing waking up scared and families suffering from a lack of sleep due to the sadness of the military activity and from a lack of sleep due to the confusion about who controls security and services in their neighborhood. At the same time, pro-Maduro crowds have taken to the streets and part of the capital, which government officials like Caracas Mayor Cameron Melendez joining demonstrators chanting for Maduro's return and asserting that the people are rising up. These protests reflect continued support for the ousted leader among factions of loyal to the previous regime and highlighted the population is not monolithically oppressed to foreign involvement. Alrighty. In other parts of Caracas and across the country, however, the streets have been unusually quiet. Many civilians are absorbing the unfolding events in silence, staying in their homes and streets remaining largely empty as people assess the risk before making public decisions. Some residents have expressed blunt fear about the situation, describing the conditions as very bad and speaking of blocked roads and general disruptions. Alongside these reactions, there are sharply different expressions among Venezuelans abroad and among some civilians who privately welcomed the reported capture. Interviews with members of Venezuelan diaspora, such as those of the U.S. communities like Kansas City, show a mixture of shock, relief, and emotional contradiction. Some say they feel relief that a government they saw as a terrorist narco regime has been toppled, even as they acknowledge concern of relatives still in Venezuela, and they worry about a broader conflict if other regime leaders remain at large. And that was by KCTV. In short, civilians are not responding in a single unified way. Instead, their reactions range from fear of anxiety to lawless protests and cautious hope, all under the shadow of uncertainty about the outcomes and what comes next. The next few days and weeks will be critical in determining whether these sentiments solidify into broader mobilization or against the transition of what is unfolding in Venezuela. Continuing from where we left off, what has become increasingly clear is that the dominant reaction among Venezuelan civilians is not ideological alignment, but emotional caution shaped by years of living under instability and repression. As the hours and days pass after the attack, the announcement of Maduro's capture, civilians are settling into a pattern of watchful waiting. Many people are limiting informal networks, family, neighbors, WhatsApp groups to gauge whether it is safe to work, travel, or even speak openly. This reaction is deeply rooted in experience. Venezuelans have learned that moments of political upheaval are often followed by reprisals, crackdowns, or sudden reversals, and that being visibly on the wrong side too early can carry severe consequences as a result. Even those who feel relief or hope are repressing outward expression, choosing silence over risk. In a working class neighborhood in poorer regions, fear is more pronounced because these communities are the most exposed to disruption, and interruptions in food distribution, fuel access, or electricity is felt immediately, and even rumors of the shortages cause families a ration more aggressively. People are not panicking in a dramatic sense, but they are tightening their margins, conserving resources, and preparing for possibility that conditions could worsen before they improve. Parents are keeping children home, and formal vendors are operating sporadically. Transportation, I just lost. Transportation is inconsistent not only because of the physical disruptions, but because diverse drivers are unsure who controls checkpoints or what rules apply. This uncertainty creates a quiet paralysis that slows daily life across the country. Alrighty. At the same time, there are visible pockets of a loyalist response, particularly in areas where the formal regime maintained strong organizational control. Pro-Maduro demonstrations, while not universal, are highly symbolic. They are meant to signal continuity, defiance, and resistance, and they are amplified through state-aligned media and official settlements. For civilians watching from the sidelines, these demonstrations do not necessarily inspire loyalty or opposition. They reinforce fear. They remind people that armed groups, political enforcers, security forces are still present and that the power struggle is not over. In this environment, neutrality becomes the safest posture, even when neutrality is emotionally exhausting. Among younger Venezuelans and families who have already lost relatives to migration, there is quieter undercurrents of cautious hope. These individuals are less attached to the symbols of the old regime and more focused on the possibilities. However, uncertain of change, but the hope is fragile and conditional. It depends on what happens next, whether violence escalates or recedes, whether institutions begin to function more predictably, and whether Venezuelans themselves are visibly involved in shaping the transition. If these conditions are not met, hope will quickly curdle into resentment and toward foreign actors, but towards emerging authority. What is especially important to understand is that civilians are not interpreting these events through the lens of U.S. domestic politics or global strategies. These are interpreting them through lived reality. Each day becomes a referendum. Is life becoming safer, more orderly, and more predictable, or more dangerous or arbitrary? If the answer trends negative, civilians will associate that decline with the moment of disruption, regardless of who they are to blame in theory. If the answer trends positive, resistance softens, even among skeptics. This is why the coming days are more important than the dramatic opening act. The initial shock fades quickly, and daily experience does not. In short, Venezuelan civilians are reacting with fear. First caution, second, and judgment later. They are not celebrating in mass and are they uniformly resisting. They are waiting to see whether this moment leads to stability or spirals into chaos. Their silence should not be mistaken as apathy or consent. It is survival strategy, and as history repeatedly shows, decided to earn civilian trust after the shock, not on the side that delivers the shock itself, ultimately determines how events will unfold. The White House's primary objective would be containment of expectations, not excitement containment. The president's base responds best to clarity, repetition, and boundaries. The messaging strategy would revolve around five pillars repeated relentlessly across speeches, press briefings, and surrogates of the Allied media. First, the administration would frame the action as finite, targeted, and concluded, even while follow-on operations continue quietly. Language matter. Operation, action, and enforcement will be used instead of war. Intervention or occupation. The president will emphasize that the mission has specific objectives. That objective has been achieved. This satisfies the base desire for decisiveness without inviting open-ended expectations. Second, the White House will stress threat neutralization, not nation building. Messaging should focus on criminal networks, narcotics, trafficking, and destabilization problems that resonate with voters concerned about broader security and domestic crime. By framing Venezuela as a source of spillover harm rather than a humanitarian crusade, the administration aligns foreign action with domestic self-interest. Third, President will repeatedly say that the U.S. will not deal. This is critical. He will explicitly state there will be no permanent U.S. governance, no long-term troop deployment, and no blank checks. Negatives are powerful with skeptical voters. Even Time reporter asked, "What's next?" The answer will include at least one clear limit. Fourth, surrogates, not the president himself, will handle the most controversial explanations. Cabinet officials, retired military figures, and allied lawmakers will argue legality, precedent, and strategic logic, allowing the president to stay focused on the outcomes rather than the justifications. This protects his personal brand as result-oriented rather than process-obsessed. And finally, the White House will tie everything back to domestic benefits, even indirectly. Stability reduces migration, pressure, energy leverage reduces price volatility, criminal disruption protects Americans. The base does not require moral abstractions, it requires a clear line from action abroad to impact at home. The 30, 60, 90 days are probably likely be the polling shifts. The first 30 days expect a modest rally effect among Republicans and right-leaning independents, especially those who prioritize strength and deterrence. Approval among the president's core base likely ticks upward, initially driven by percentages of decisiveness and the control opposition voters harden more quickly, but that has already priced in. Key variable whether casualties occur or the situation visibly escalates. If not, the approval could stabilize. Within the 30 to 60 days, this is the danger zone. The rally fades and voters begin asking practical questions, and the polling among America First but war-weary voters becomes volatile. If there is no clear exit language, support softens. If Congress begins holding hearings framed as what we doing there, concern grows even among the supporters. Some key variables of clarity: if the administration presents a defined transition framework and limits the U.S. exposure, supports plateaus rather than collapses. Around the 60 to 90 days, at this stage, the action is judged by the consequences, not intent. If energy markets stabilize and the migration does not spike and headlines quiet down, support consolidates and comes more together. If the base moves, if instability persists, or if U.S. responsibility appears to expand, skepticism becomes entrenched, and that will bring a lot of criticism and not cohesion. This is where previous administrations lost control of the narratives, and the president's political skill will determine whether it becomes a background noise or his defining controversy. Opponents will not argue primarily on morality, they will argue on credibility and the consistency. Their first line of attack will be, he promised no new wars, and this is one. This will repeat relentlessly regardless of the technical definitions. The goal is to create cognitive dissonance among some voters and soft supporters, not persuade hardliners. All right. Secondly, they will frame this as executive overreach. Even voters who support strong leadership are weary of acknowledging unchecked power. Opponents will highlight lack of congressional authorization, secrecy, and precedent. The subtext will be, if we did there, what stops him elsewhere? And this is already going on. We've done seen it on the news and online. There will be questions, motives, especially oil. Whether or not oil was decisive is its most irrelevant politically. The allegations alone is powerful. War of oil is one of the few bipartisan skepticism triggers left in American politics. Except the ads, hearings, and op-eds connecting energy interests, donors, and foreign policy decisions. And fourthly, best case versus worst case political outcomes could be, first, the best case scenario, the action remains limited. Venezuela transitions under international supervision and the energy markets stabilize. U.S. involvement visibly recedes. The president is seen as being active decisively without overcommitting. Among his base, the episode becomes proof that the strength does not require endless war among swing voters. It becomes a non-issue. Now, politically, this reinforces the president's core brand, unpredictable to adversaries, disciplined at home. Now, the worst case scenario of the situation could be drags on, power vacuums emerge, and U.S. force remains engaged longer than promised. Congress asserts itself publicly, migration increases, energy prices fluctuate, the base fractures, not dramatically but persistently. As trust erodes, the president is forced to spend political capital defending foreign policy rather than advancing on his domestic priorities. In this scenario, the actions become symbolic and broken promises, not because of intent, but because of the outcome. Alrighty. This is not a question of whether the president can survive this politically. He can. The real question is whether he can close the loop, define the end, show results, and disengage before ownership sets in. Foreign policy rarely destroys presidencies overnight. It erodes them slowly when promises blur and narratives lose cohesion. Right now, the story is still in his control. As I wrap up this, I want to bring everything we've discussed into a clear focus, because has unfolded, and it is not just dramatic headlines or a single military action, but a moment that has reshaped fear, hope, and uncertainty for millions of Venezuelan civilians, and has placed the United States at a pivotal crossroads geopolitically and morally. We've walked through how the event shocked the country into a pause, how ordinary people responded not within celebrations or uniform resistance, but with caution, silence, and survival instincts, shaped by years of instability, and how daily life, food, electricity, safety, movement became the true measure by which this moment is being judged. We've examined how reactions inside Venezuela are fractured and how loyalists remain loud and organized. How many civilians quietly hope for change while fearing chaos, and how legitimacy now depends less on power exercised and more on restraint shown. We've talked about this effective the United States politically, how it tests promises of avoiding endless foreign entanglements, how it was scrutinized by allies and adversaries alike, and how the outcomes will ultimately be determined not by speeches or announcements, but by whether Venezuelans experience greater stability and dignity and self-determination in the days to come. This moment is still unfolding, and history will not judge it by how it began, but how responsibly it is carried forward and how carefully it is concluded. I appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen and think through this complex and serious topic with me. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like the video, share it with others who have a deeper context beyond the headlines, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future analysis as the situation continues to develop. Thank you and have a great day.